So let's talk about something fascinating. We're going to look at an analysis that connects two events in Atlanta that, on the surface, seem totally unrelated. The city shutting down street vendors and the massive YSL RICO trial. But what if they're not separate at all? What if they're actually two sides of the same coin, part of a much bigger, more troubling pattern? Let's dive in.
And really, this whole analysis boils down to one central question. What happens when the very people in charge of enforcing the law decide, you know what, those rules don't apply to me? And look, this isn't just about Atlanta, right? This is a question about power and accountability that could apply almost anywhere.
To really wrap our heads around this pattern, the source we're looking at gives it a pretty powerful name, the architecture of defiance. It's basically a framework for how people in power can push the boundaries, step by step, just to see what they can get away with. This idea is going to be our guide for the next few minutes.
Okay, so let's start with the first case study. The source calls this physical extraction. And this whole story starts not in some fancy courtroom, but right on the sidewalks of Atlanta.
So here's what happened, and it's kind of a one-two punch. First, the act itself. The city, under its mayor at the time, Kasim Reed, just suddenly shut down a whole bunch of street vendors. We're talking people's livelihoods, gone. But then comes the defiance. A court actually stepped in and said, hey, you have to respect their rights, you have to follow due process. And the administration just didn't. They ignored the ruling.
The source has this brilliant phrase for what happened here: institutional literacy without institutional integrity. It means, yeah, the city knew the rules, they totally understood the law, they knew what the court was saying, but they chose to act without integrity, basically deciding that their own political agenda was way more important than actually following the law.
And that's the real kicker here, right? The message this sends. The argument is that this was never just about the vendors. It was a signal to everyone that your basic rights, like due process, could be tossed aside whenever the city's self-proclaimed owner felt like it. And that, right there, sets a really dangerous precedent.
All right, so let's pivot to the second case and see how this whole thing levels up. The analysis argues that the YSL RICO case represents a shift from literally physically removing people to something it calls narrative extraction.
So you can see the playbook changing a little bit here. For the vendors, the magic words were urban renewal. But in the YSL case, it's all about public safety and gang suppression. The source says that even though the justifications sound completely different, the underlying move is exactly the same. Find a powerful story that lets you bypass constitutional protections.
And this points to something the analysis calls a stewardship gap. The idea here is that these actions show a worldview where the Constitution and the Bill of Rights aren't treated as this sacred foundation we all rely on. Instead, they just become an obstacle, an inconvenient hurdle you have to get around to achieve your goals.
And wow, this just lays it all out, doesn't it? On the left, you've got the vendors. The story, urban progress. The method, just flat out defy a court order. On the right, the YSL case. The story, gang suppression. The method, using rap lyrics as evidence, which you know is a hugely debated First Amendment issue in courtrooms all across the country. See the pattern? Two different cases, one very similar playbook.
Okay, so now that we've looked at both cases separately, this is where the source really ties it all together into what it calls the pattern of repetition. This is where you get that aha moment.
This table right here is basically the heart of the entire argument. Just look at how it lines everything up. For the street vendors, you use the urban progress story to take away the constitutional value of due process. With the YSL case, you use the gang suppression story to chip away at the First Amendment and fair trial. And in both situations, the signal being sent is one of absolute control. This is my city, defying the normal rules to get things done.
But hold on, because the analysis goes one level deeper, and this is where it points out something really powerful, a tragic irony at the center of all of this.
Okay, this next point is a tough one, but it's absolutely central to the argument. The source suggests that leaders can sometimes use their own community's history of being oppressed as a kind of shield. It protects them from criticism, even while they're using the same kind of arbitrary power tactics that were once used against their own people. It's described as a performance of community protection that actually hides the same old mechanics of control.
And man, this all builds to one heck of a final line. The tragedy, according to this analysis, happens when leaders get amazing at the performance of justice, the tough press conferences, the dramatic sound bites, while at the same time, they've abandoned the actual practice of law, the part that has rules and limits and is supposed to protect everyone.
And that brings us right back to where we started. The source leaves us with this final, really heavy question to think about. When you build this architecture of defiance, brick by brick, one vendor stand and one courtroom drama at a time, what force is left to hold power accountable? What's the backstop? And that's the question this analysis really asks all of us to consider.